Hello and welcome to Track 1, Workshop 3, the Special Education Continuum of Services. I am Lauren Klein, a member of the Family and Community Engagement team here with the Special Education Office at the New York City Department of Education. Before we get started, I want to make sure everyone who needs it has access to interpretation. Can our Spanish interpreter put their camera on and share information? Cesar, are you with us?
Yes, ma'am. Buenas noches para todos ustedes que nos están acompañando en este taller esta noche y a usted le gustaría recibir el audio en español. Le voy a pedir por favor que marquen el siguiente número de teléfono 347-966-4114 e ingresar el número de conferencia 148-478-58 numeral. De nuevo, si usted nos acompaña en este espacio virtual esta noche y a usted le gustaría escuchar el audio en español, marque el número de teléfono 347-966-4114 e ingresar el número de conferencia 148-478-58 numeral. Les voy a pedir por favor que si están escuchando el audio en el teléfono y tienen algún otro dispositivo viendo la conferencia en Zoom, por favor pongan mudo en los otros dispositivos para evitar cualquier ruido de fondo. Gracias.
Thank you, Cesar. And now I want to introduce Yang, who will be providing Mandarin interpretation.
This is Mandarin announcement. 晚上好，收听中文频道的，请拨打347-966-4114，然后输入密码或会议 ID 946-644-234井号键。中文翻译频道，请拨打347-966-4114，然后输入会议密码或者 ID 946-644-234井号键。如果您想听普通话音频并想待在这个虚拟会议中，以便在电脑上看到会议的话，请将电脑调到静音，然后用电话拨打普通话会议频道。再说一遍，中文翻译频道请拨打347-966-4114，然后输入会议密码或者 ID 946-644-234井号键。谢谢 ，Thank you。
We also have Jose here with us who will be providing American Sign Language interpreting. Hopefully everyone can see Jose on your screen, and Sarah will be taking over for him during certain parts of the workshop. So now I'd like to introduce our two co-facilitators. The first is Lauren Bolin. She is the Executive Director of Regional Partnerships and Transition. She has also worn many hats across her career as a special education teacher, a principal, a supervisor, a counselor, and so much more with the Central Department of Education. We also have Peter Schmidt, who is the Senior Advisor for School Planning and Strategic Instruction. His job is to work with schools to ensure that all students receive their IEP mandated services. He's also been a special education teacher before coming to the Central Department of Education for more than a decade. Now, if you have questions throughout the presentation, please enter them into the Q&A. We will answer some of them along the way, but many will reserve for the end, and we'll be able to share them with all of you since we know many have the same questions. And without further ado, here is Lauren and Peter.
Thanks so much, Lauren. We also share the spelling of our name, which is very unusual. So that's everyone saying Lauren Bolin and Lauren Klein. But anyway, thank you so much. And thank you everybody who's here for this 6 o'clock session. We really appreciate you joining us this evening. I am going to share my screen and hopefully that will just take half a moment, and then we should be all set. Great. I think we're all set. I am happy that Peter Schmidt is here with me as well. He's not able to be on camera, I just want to say. So Peter and I have had the pleasure of working together in the special education office. I am going to stop my video as well. I'm going to join him offline, and he's going to feel free to jump in. He's also going to help Lauren monitor the chat and the Q&A as we proceed. So, so I'm really happy about that because I won't be able to see it while I'm speaking. So, so he'll be in there with you. Okay.
Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah. Oh, there we go. You want to say anything else, Peter, as we get going?
It's all just a pleasure to be here.
Great. All right. So we are going to talk about the continuum. Some of you have heard it referenced as the continuum of special education services, or the special education continuum, excuse me. That's what we're going to dig into a little bit this evening. And with the ultimate goal, of course, of providing the right level of programs and services for all of our students who have IEPs, so that we can help them attain whatever their post-secondary goals may be, whether it's college, career, independent living, etc. And so we are going to talk about what the continuum of services are. We're going to talk a little bit about why this is important. We're going to look at some IEP recommendations along the continuum, and we are going to talk about your role as a parent in this entire process. So again, it's really three major parts. What is the continuum? Why is it important? And how can I make sure that I have input in the decision-making process and that my child has the right level of programs and services? So first, what is the continuum? So these are some definitions. The continuum of services is just that. It's the variety of different services that can be provided to students. The continuum of placement is, when we think about that, we think about where are those services going to be provided? What type of school is the student going to attend? And then a third very important concept that we're going to keep circling back to as we explore the continuum is the least restrictive environment. And the least restrictive environment, like it says here, is the extent to which services are provided to the student with a disability with their non-disabled peers and close to the student's home. So the legal definition of LRE, or least restrictive environment, is here. It means the education environment occurs only when the nature or severity of the disability is such that even with the use of supplementary aids and services, education cannot be satisfactorily achieved. So I read that because there is a few really important concepts in there, and we are going to talk a little bit more about what some of them mean, like supplementary aids and services, for example. But it's just really important to think about the fact that that even if a student requires a lot of services or different kinds of services, that those services can be provided in the general education classroom, and should be. And LRE, like we said, is the other part of the definition is below here that we did mention already. We measure LRE by the extent that services are provided to students in a setting with the student's non-disabled peers and as close to the student's home as possible. So that is the legal definition. It has been the law since 1975. It's not new. And so when we make determinations in an IEP meeting, for example, about placement, placement needs to go along with that idea of LRE. So it has to be based on the student's IEP, and it has to really make sure that we're not removing students from their regular classroom just because they need supplementary aids and services, and also not because they need modifications of the general education curriculum. A lot of people think that if modifications of the curriculum are needed, that means that a different kind of program or placement might be needed. And what the regulations tell us, and also what best practice tells us, is that that's not actually the case, that modifications in the general education curriculum can be and should be provided in the general education classroom. So I know I'm going through this part a little bit quickly, I think I need to maybe slow down for the interpreters, just a drop. But everything that we just talked about really leads us to our guiding principles. So when we think about the continuum, we use these guiding principles to help us. And so the first one says all students must have a sense of belonging and acceptance, inspired and reinforced by their school community, no matter what their school community is, right? So no matter what kind of school a student goes to, no matter what kind of program or services the student is receiving, they still should have a sense of belonging. So if a student is attending a special class, for example, for most of their day in a District 1 through 32 school, then they're not separate just because they're attending a class together with other students with IEPs. They are fully part of that school community. General education is always the first consideration for any student with an IEP, and we did talk a little bit about that because that's right there within the definition of least restrictive environment. So we always start with general education in mind, and then and see what we can provide in general education environment in order to support the student. Decision-making regarding special education services is a team process inclusive of the family and as much as possible the student as well. And that's super important. And we're going to circle back to that towards the end of our time together as well. And then we talked about this as well, that supplementary aids and services, accommodations, modifications, and specially designed instruction can and should be provided in the general education classroom. So keeping those guiding principles in mind, when we think about a continuum, right, we think about something along a continuum. So we have more and we have less. We have less restrictive recommendations here by the general education, right? And then we have some more restrictive as we go to the right of this little diagram. And so it's important to note that related services and supplemental aids and services can be provided anywhere along the continuum. They can be provided in a general education setting, in a special class, or in a special school. And so this is a visualization or a visual representation, excuse me, of the continuum of services and programs and placements. That's a little bit more detailed than that other one. And we could spend some time here, but I just want to point out a few things about this particular visual representation. So again, this biggest part down here, the green, is general education. That's what that's representing. And you'll notice this, this visual representation may be a little bit different if you've seen other ones in the past, because here ICT, which we're going to talk about in a minute, special education teacher support services, those kinds of services are actually within the general education classroom often. So the special education teacher support services, or SETS, as we like to say in New York City, can also occur in a different location outside of the general education classroom. Or a student can receive their specially designed instruction in a special class together with other students who also have IEPs. And you'll notice that there's some different shading here, and we're going to talk a little bit more about why that's the case in a minute as well. And as you go up, there's actually hopefully fewer and fewer students in each of these placements, but we do also have students in a special class in a specialized school, home and hospital instruction, non-public day, day in residential schools. And then again, just like in the other visual representation, related services, supplementary aids and services, program modifications and accommodations, they span all of these different different programs and services and placements.
And Lauren,
Yep.
I think it's worth mentioning that, you know, these shouldn't be seen as buckets where a student spends all of their day necessarily. A student could be recommended for one or a number of these different services, depending on their needs in a particular subject during the day.
Absolutely. And we will talk a little bit more about that in a moment as well. So, but you're right, because certain things are not super clear just from this one visual representation. So it's really important to think about that. These are not, yeah. When we talk about intensity versus restrictiveness, we can think about the student to staff ratio and also the frequency of the service. So restrictiveness, we said, is time with non-disabled peers and proximity, or how close you are to your home, right? And the reason, I just want to say, one of the reasons that I think that that's part of the definition, right, is that we really want to support all schools in welcoming all students to the greatest extent possible. And so, you know, there was a time when a student would have to get on a bus and go across town because their IEP recommended a special class, for example. And so we really want students to be able to receive their services in their community to the extent possible, like I said, and also spend time with non-disabled peers. Now that's restrictiveness. Intensity of services, the level of intensity of service, is another idea, and that has to do with how frequently the service occurs and also the student to staff ratio. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that also. But like Peter said, when we think about frequency, just because a student, for example, an 8th grade student is receiving ICT services for math. That does not mean that 8th grade student is going to be receiving ICT services for all of their different subjects. They may really just need ICT services for math. And so it's really important to remember that these are not full-time, every day, all the time recommendations. It really depends on the individual needs, of course, of each of the students. And we're always making recommendations on IEPs that are dependent on the individual needs of the students, but we really want to keep all of this in mind while we're doing that. And so, and 8th grade was just an example. Of course, that can be for a student in any grade. And this is just another way, one more, this is, I think, our last for a while, visual representation. But what you can see in this one is that restrictiveness is this blue line that goes horizontally down here. And intensity is this orange line that goes up and down. So for example, if a student is receiving a special class for ELA, let's say, then, you know, all these are special classes because they're all pretty restrictive, right? Because you're not with your non-disabled peers in a special class, you're with other students with similar needs in a special class. And so they're at the same point on this restrictiveness arrow. They're towards this end of the restrictiveness, but they're at very different places along the intensity. They're up and down, and that's because they have different ratios. So this one, I think it's a little fuzzy, and I apologize for that. It's very clear on mine, and I'm looking at the shared screen and it looks fuzzy. But the one down here, it says special class 12:1, and that means 12 students and 1 teacher. The one right above it says special class 12:1 plus 1. So in that classroom, there are up to 12 students, 1 special education teacher, and also 1 paraprofessional. And then above that, there's only 8 students and 2 adults, a teacher and a paraprofessional. So you can see the level of intensity actually increases, even though they're all the same level of restrictiveness because they're all special class. Hopefully, if there's any questions about that in the chat, Peter is answering away. But those are 2 very important ideas that we have when we think about the continuum. And now for some reason, sorry about that. Can't seem to, oh, okay, there we go. There's the other ones. The other thing that I'll just mention really quickly here, we talked a little bit about sets in the classroom versus sets in a separate location and related services in a separate location as well. Actually, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute and some of the, the benefits of providing services in the classroom. And then, of course, sometimes services are needed to be separate outside of that classroom, and some of the ideas that go into that decision-making process. So the next few slides just take us through a very brief explanation of each of those programs and services that we saw on the visual representation of the continuum. I'm going to go through them just a little bit quickly because I want to get to make sure we get to some other information. But we know that general education, we know what that is and that we're always starting with general education. But it's also important to think about the fact that there's almost always students with and without IEPs in general education classes. So just because it's called general education does not mean that it's only for students who don't have IEPs. That's not at all what it means. So it is important to note that, and that students with IEPs receive their services often in general education classes. Integrated co-teaching is what ICT stands for. ICT is also taking place in the general education classroom and can be recommended for a particular subject or content area as needed. So ICT is services that are provided to a group of students with and without IEPs by 2 teachers. One is a general education or content area teacher, and the other is a special education teacher. And those 2 teachers really work together in an ICT class in order to meet the needs of all of the students in that class. The special education teacher does provide specially designed instruction based on the impact of the student's disability so that they can make sure that all of the students are accessing the general education curriculum. And the next one is special education teacher support services, or SETS. So SETS can be provided, like we said before, in different ways. And 2 of those ways are direct SETS or indirect SETS. Direct SETS is when we provide services directly to students, and it's up to a group of 8 in New York City. Indirect SETS is when the special education teacher or the SETS provider provides consultation to a general education teacher in order to assist that teacher in adjusting the learning environment or modifying instructional methods in order to meet the needs of specific students with IEPs. So it's more of a consultation model, whereas direct SETS, the services are being provided directly to the students. Also, direct SETS can be provided in the general education classroom or in a separate location. So when the service is being provided in the general education classroom, and again, any of these can occur for any particular subject areas. SETS cannot be more than 50% of the student's day. But when it is occurring in the general education curriculum classroom, it's in order to make sure that students are accessing the general education curriculum. So it's part of that core instruction. But we can adapt the content methodology or delivery of instruction in order to support students. When SETS is provided in a separate location, then it's supplementary. It's in addition to the core instruction that the student is providing. So for example, if a student needs a very specialized research-based reading program that's not being offered as part of the general curriculum in the classroom, they may receive that outside of the classroom in a small group in order to learn, I don't know, decoding or fluency skills. But when they're in that classroom and they're participating in the ELA lesson with both teachers, then the teachers are making sure that that student can access that content, whether or not they're reading on grade level, because they're going to get that supplementary instruction outside of the classroom. That's just one example. Whenever services, I am going to say, can be provided within the classroom, I think it's always helpful for the teachers and also for the students. And we'll talk a little bit more about why in a second. But the next program or service along the continuum is special class. We did talk about that a little bit already, that a special class is a class consisting only of students with IEPs. And so when students are in a special class, their content instruction and their specially designed instruction are all provided from the special education teacher in that special class, sorry. So again, students can be recommended for special class in any number of subjects for all or for part of their instructional program. And it's really important to remember that. And that special classes can have different levels of intensity depending on the number of periods that a student receives their instruction in a special class, and also depending on the adult to student ratio. And so these are some of the special class ratios that are available in New York City. Just quickly, most high schools for special class use a 15:1 ratio, which means that there are up to 15 students and one special education teacher. We also utilize 12:1, especially in K-8 programs, which means up to 12 students and one teacher. 12:1 means that there are students with management needs where that additional adult is needed. So the paraprofessional is present. That's the +1. And then, as the management needs of the students increase, so does the intensity. Most people refer to this last one that's on this slide, 12:1 plus 3:1. It looks complicated. We usually say 12:1 to 4. We just add that 3 and 1 together. In New York City, usually the 12:1 to 4 classes are typically found within District 75 programs, and they are designed for students with significant or complex needs whose programs consist of habilitation, daily living skills, etc. So what it means is that there's never more than a 1-to-3 ratio at any given time. So 1 staff member to 3 students. If you do the math, 12:1 4, so never more than 3 students and one adult in that classroom at one time. Peter, anything to add about anything I said so far? I know I'm going through it a little bit quickly.
All right. No, I have nothing. Yeah, you're covering everything, Laura.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so then there do exist also special schools, specialized schools. Some District 75 programs are considered specialized schools. District 75, I want to say, though, does offer a range of program options. So there is an inclusion program, which takes place in a District 1 through 32 school building. And the students actually do attend general education classes, but they have support from District 75 staff members. Also, many classes, most actually at this point, that are being provided by district, working from home, dog is loud. So most classes that are being provided by District 75 are actually located within a District 1 through 32 school building. And that's great because that gives a lot of opportunity for collaboration and inclusion. And then there are some District 75 programs that are in their own school building. There are also state-approved non-public schools, which are also another kind of specialized school. And then there are day treatment programs, hospital instruction, and home instruction. So day treatment programs are coordinated with the Office of Mental Health. And I actually put severe emotional disabilities, not emotional disturbances. Those of you who were on earlier with Christina Foti know the very exciting news that we're looking to change that emotional disturbance classification. But anyway, hospital is what it sounds like. If the student is hospitalized and unable to attend school, then they would receive their instruction within the hospital. And home instruction is, of course, also what it sounds like. The student is receiving their instruction at home. Often it's for a temporary period of time. And so just noting again that within that whole continuum of programs and placements, there are many services that can be provided in any setting. And this is a list of some of them. So related services, supplementary aids and services, paraprofessionals, assistive technology, supports for school personnel on behalf of the student, that is an IEP section, and accommodations and modifications. Supports for school personnel can include, for example, if the student is receiving assistive technology and the school personnel needs to be trained on how to use that assistive technology with the student, that would be an example of a support for school personnel on behalf of the student. And so some of you may have attended the related services session right before this session. If you did, then you have probably seen this slide already. But it's worth noting that the related services guiding philosophy is very aligned to everything that we're talking about here in our session, which is that, related services should always be delivered in the least restrictive environment, and as much as appropriate, schools should integrate them into the classroom. And so the fundamental objective of related services is to help maximize each student's ability to achieve their goals, their educational goals, which is very important. There's a lot of benefits to related services taking place in the classroom. Lauren Klein mentioned at the beginning that one of my many wonderful jobs that I've had within the New York City Department of Education was being a school principal. And I have to say that as a school principal, I was always thrilled when my students were receiving their related services in the classroom, because my teachers were thrilled, because it made it really easy for them to carry over some of those strategies, some of the skills that students were learning through other parts of the school day, and to really kind of informally also just check in with the related service providers and make sure that they were on the same page, the students were progressing, they were supporting them throughout the school day. Students were able to generalize those schools and learn them in a more natural environment. So it was always really helpful. Now, that's not to say that there will never be a time when a student needs to have their services delivered in a separate location. Of course, that will occur as well. But it's just something to really think about when we're in IEP meetings, is whether some of those services can be provided within the classroom, because also then the student is not missing any of their regular instruction either. So there's all kinds of benefits to that.
Lauren, if I could add to that, I just 2 points. I think Lauren's point about the amount of instruction missed versus the benefit of getting services in a separate location, that is a question that as a parent, you should feel free to ask at an IEP meeting about how much time your child would be spending outside of the classroom where and their core instruction, and whether any of the services they're recommended for could be provided adequately within the gen ed classroom. I'll also speak from experience as a special ed teacher that the opportunity to see students who I taught in a special class transition into a less restrictive environment and receive services ICT in the gen ed classroom and see them blossom in that environment was really rewarding. And I think I would advocate for, in that way, like giving students the opportunity to participate in the gen ed classroom as often as possible, because they can see that kind of success.
Thank you, Peter. Absolutely. These are some of the more commonly provided related services, if you will: occupational therapy, physical therapy, and speech therapy, and some definitions. And you'll note, I'm not going to read the whole slide, but you will note that each of them are to improve access to or function in education-related activities. So speech, for example, you know, it's to build the skills needed in listening, speaking, and communication that students need in order to experience success in school. So there's always that connection to, you know, how is this going to help the student in school? And since we talked, we mentioned supplementary aids and services a few times. This is the legal definition of supplemental aids, supplementary aids and services. It's even right here in the definition that it means that aid services and other supports that are provided in regular education classes, other education-related settings, extracurricular, any setting really, to enable children with disabilities to be educated with non-disabled children to the maximum extent appropriate in accordance with the least restrictive environment. So, so that is in the definition of supplementary aids and services. And this is some examples of supplementary aids and services, and all of them can absolutely be provided in any setting. So assistive technology is here, just simple things like allowing for breaks or changing the instruction in some way, changing the physical adaptations, using preferential seating, lots of different kinds of aids and services that can be provided to students. Extra time. These are some more examples: a visual schedule, simplifying the language, adapting the materials. All of these are examples of supplementary aids and services that can be provided in any setting. And so now, why is all of this so important? Why do you need to know about this, right? We talked a lot about different programs and services and placements along the continuum. We talked about restrictiveness and intensity of services. So why is this important? I hope you already think it's important, but we're going to talk a little bit more about why it's so important. So this is just, it says terminology because there is one representation of exclusion, segregation, integration, and then at the top, inclusion. But if you look along the side, one of the terms that's there is mainstreaming. And so if this were a little bit more interactive and I wasn't doing all of the talking, which hopefully in a smaller group someday we could do it that way, I would ask, which of these you feel represents mainstreaming. Mainstreaming is a term that we used to use to indicate when a student with an IEP who had a special class recommendation was attending a general education class, maybe for one particular subject area that they were particularly strong in. And the challenge with that model, well, there's a couple of challenges. One, the student was always kind of extra, right? Like there had to be enough space in the room. There had, it couldn't be an overcrowded classroom that was already over the register. And the student was kind of a visitor, and they had to earn their way into that classroom, either by behaving or excelling at that particular subject. When we think about inclusion, we think about really from the onset, all students are part of this community. They're part of the school community, they're part of the classroom community. They don't have to earn their way in, right? And so that's a really big difference between mainstreaming and inclusion. And we've come a long way, right? Because before 1975, like we said earlier, we were really here at this exclusion part. And then, after students were allowed to go to school, students who had disabilities, they were still very segregated for quite a while. And then folks started thinking, well, maybe we should integrate them, and students should be able to come to, schools and classrooms with other students. But even within the classroom, they were still kind of in their own little space. And so true inclusion looks a little bit more like that one at the top. And some of you may have seen different versions of this slide as well, but this slide is just a reminder that, fair and equal and equality, these are all different ideas, and that fair is not, or equality really is not giving every student the same thing, right? So you can see there's a fence, there's a baseball game going on, there's 3 children of different heights. They're all given the same box in that first panel. And so, one of them still can't see over the fence. In the second panel, they're each given what they need in terms of the boxes in order to be able to see over the fence. And so that's a little better, right? But in the third panel, whenever we can, we need to remember that sometimes thinking of, the child as disabled and is not really the most productive way to think of things, and that the environment is disabling sometimes, right? And so if we can change that environment and we can remove barriers, then that's really the best of those options. And there are other versions of this slide that show actually the children tearing down the fence and giving them agency, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think you get the basic idea of this from these. And so in addition to thinking of issues of equity for students with IEPs, the research shows that students who spend more time in inclusive settings actually do much better. And research has shown that, time and time again, and we're really happy to share that research with you. And so we're still educating some students with IEPs separately at a higher than expected rate. And some subgroups disproportionately at a much higher rate are being, recommended for more restrictive settings. And it's so, and so again, just thinking about equity, we want to be very mindful that we're doing everything that we can to not enable that to continue to happen, right? We want to support students in our community schools, and we want to make sure that their needs are being met. And when students need a different level of intensity or restrictiveness, we want to provide that too, but we want to be really sure that we're doing it in a way that's going to, you know, to help to set them up for success and not set them on a path that's, you know, separate and sorry, but not usually equal. Okay. So having said all that, we're down to 5 minutes to talk about your role in this process, but that is okay. If any of you went to the Ask and Share session earlier at 4 o'clock today, then a couple of these slides might actually look familiar to you. Including this one. This one is just telling us, again, we're looking at the research and we're seeing that a strong family school partnership results in better outcomes for students. It sounds simple, but it's really not that simple. And so we want to do everything that we can to ensure that we're promoting and supporting and lifting up that strong family school partnership in whatever ways we are able to do so. This is an overview of the special education process. We're not going to get into the details of it in this session. Hopefully you went to the other 2 sessions and so you learned all about it. But this is just to reinforce that you are part of the process in each step. In fact, some of this can't even happen without your consent. So it's just really important to remember that you're a critical member of the IEP team and that the IEP is central to the special education process. And it details, you know, the unique needs of your student and also lays out a plan for how we're going to meet those needs. And the important thing when we're thinking about the different sections of the IEP, again, hopefully you went to, if you didn't go to one of the other sessions, that's okay, because we're going to share some resources with you. But oops, did not mean to go past that last one, placement. This is in order for a reason. So in an IEP, we always start with the present level of performance. That's what gives us a picture of how your child is doing. What are their strengths? What are their areas of challenge? What is their learning style like? How do they learn best, right? And then we set goals. We recommend services and programs to help them meet those goals. You know, if your child is 14 or over, we talk a lot about post-secondary goals and coordinated sets of transition activities. And then the last thing we talk about at the end is placement. Where is your child going to receive all of those services that we just talked about? So,
And Lauren, just on that slide to jump in, I'm sorry. There are a number of questions in the Q&A about sort of the rationale for service recommendations, particularly where the services occur, whether it's in a District 75 school versus a community school, or in the classroom, gen ed classroom versus a separate location. And the present levels of performance in particular, for those of you who are asking, is the place where an IEP team would document the rationale for those decisions. Why they would recommend, for instance, speech in a separate location versus in the gen ed classroom. And I'll call back to Lauren mentioned the Ask and Share is a tool designed to help you ask those questions during an IEP meeting about why certain decisions are being made, and they should be clearly documented in the IEP.
Definitely. Thank you. You know, we also get questions sometimes about specialized programs versus District 75 programs. And I would love to talk a little bit more about that in a minute as well. So thank you, Peter. These are some sample guiding questions for programs, service and placement recommendations that you can think about going into an IEP meeting, because, you know, like Peter just said, yes, the present level of performance should absolutely document the information needed to help in the decision-making process, but it is still a decision-making process, right? And sometimes a student can be served in different ways. There's not just one way to serve each student. In fact, far from it. And so it really should be a conversation about, you know, how you think your student would best be served, your child. And so these are just some guiding questions to think about in terms of what supports have been successful with your child. Have they been supported in a general education setting? If so, what worked best? What do you hope for your child? What are your dreams? What are your biggest concerns? It's really important. Give me one more minute, Lauren, please. I see you jumping on, and I know we're just at time, but I do want to say that you don't have to remember all of these questions. Peter is always like just half a step ahead of me. We do have the information here for the ask and share. Some of you may have gone to the session, many of you may not have. So we just wanted to make sure that you had this as a resource and that you have, we can put a link to it in the chat. Hopefully, maybe Lauren, thank you so much, because it has even more guiding questions. Let me put it that way. Things to do to prepare for the IEP meeting during and after. And it's called Ask and Share because it has ideas about questions you might want to ask about each section of the IEP, and then also things that you may consider sharing about your particular child during the IEP meeting. And so it is a really great resource. We do recommend that you take a look at it. There's also some additional information in the Family Guide for Special Education Services. And I know that we're out of time now, so I apologize for that. But this is the last slide, so I think we just snuck it in there. So thank you so much. I really, again, appreciate everyone joining us this evening.
Lauren, thank you. And thank you, Peter. We got so much positive feedback already through the Q&A for your very comprehensive and informative presentation. We were able to get to many of your questions through the Q&A, but of course, if you didn't hear from us and you need support, please email specialeducation@schools.nyc.gov. I also put a link to all those resources in the chat, which are all on our website, along with many others. We encourage you to join us at 7 o'clock for the closing. Thank you for being here.